A picture-perfect family, an English husband, an American wife, and their newborn daughter, settled into a quiet suburban home in Massachusetts. But within months, a dark secret unraveled. One morning, Rachel and baby Lillian were found brutally murdered in their own bed. The prime suspect? The man who was supposed to love and protect them, Neil Entwistle. But what drove him to commit such a horrifying crime? And how did investigators uncover the chilling truth? Hey, true crime fans. I'm Eamon, and I'm thrilled to share crime tales across times with you. Each episode will explore a new case, examining the evidence and discussing the twists and turns. My goal is to create a community where we can discuss these cases, share our thoughts, and learn from each other. So, let's get started. On the morning of January 20th, 2006, Rachel's family grew worried when they couldn't reach her. Calls went unanswered, texts ignored. When a family friend entered the Entwistle home, what they found was horrifying. Rachel and baby Lillian lay motionless in bed, covered by a blanket, each shot at close range. There was no sign of forced entry, and oddly enough, Neil was nowhere to be found. Rachel Souza Entwistle was born on November 14th, 1978, in Kingston, Massachusetts. Raised in a close-knit family, she was described as bright, kind, and deeply compassionate. She had an infectious warmth, the kind of person who could make anyone feel welcome. Rachel pursued her education at the College of the Holy Cross, where she graduated with a degree in English and elementary education. She had a passion for teaching and worked as a teacher in Massachusetts before pursuing further studies abroad. It was during her time at the University of York in England, where she was on an exchange program, that she met the man who would change her life forever. Neil Entwistle was born in Nottinghamshire, England, in Gwythythe, 1978. He came from a modest, working-class background, but he was highly ambitious. His intelligence and charm made him popular among his peers, and he had a strong desire to build a life of wealth and prestige, something that often overshadowed his reality. Neil studied at the University of York, where he pursued a degree in electronic engineering. He had a knack for computers and an interest in online businesses, but while he was bright, he was also deeply insecure, constantly comparing himself to others who had more wealth and success. It was at York that our Neil met Rachel. She was an American student with a warm heart, and he was the charming British gentleman who swept her off her feet. Their romance blossomed quickly. Neil's British charm and intelligence captivated Rachel, while Rachel's kindness and ambition impressed Neil. They were inseparable. After Rachel completed her studies, the two maintained a long-distance relationship, making trips between the US and England to see each other. 2003, after 4 years of dating, they tied the knot in a beautiful wedding ceremony in Massachusetts. Rachel's family adored Neil. They believed he was a responsible, hardworking man who would provide a good life for their daughter. For a while, things seemed perfect. Rachel and Neil moved to England, where Neil worked in the tech industry and Rachel began teaching. They traveled, shared romantic moments, and seemed like the ideal young couple with a promising future. But underneath Neil's polished exterior, cracks were forming. In 2005, Rachel was thrilled when they decided to move back to the United States to be closer to her family. They settled in Hopkinton, Massachusetts, a quiet, picturesque town. Rachel had recently given birth to their daughter, Lillian Rose, and was excited about starting this new chapter. Neil had a secret. Rachel believed Neil was running a highly successful online business, bringing in substantial income. In reality, he was unemployed. His so-called business ventures had failed, and he was drowning in the thousands of dollars of debt. Despite having no steady income, Neil continued to simply live extravagantly, buying expensive gadgets and maintaining a lifestyle he could no longer afford. To maintain the illusion of success, he maxed out credit cards, borrowed money, and even considered illegal ways to make cash online. Rachel, trusting and devoted, had no idea about the extent of his financial problems. She continued to care for their daughter, believing Neil was providing for them. But by January 2006, Neil knew his lies were catching up with him. The debts were piling up. He had no job, no money, and no way out. He knew that if Rachel discovered the truth, their perfect life would collapse. And so, on January 20th, 2006, Neil Entwistle made a chilling decision, one that would shatter the lives of everyone who had ever trusted him. In their quiet home in Hopkinton, Neil picked up a gun, walked into the bedroom where Rachel and Lillian were sleeping, and changed their lives forever. What happened next would send shockwaves across the world. On January 21st, 2006, a chilling silence filled the Entwistle home in Hopkinton, Massachusetts. The neighborhood was peaceful, as always, but inside the house, an unspeakable crime had taken place. Rachel and her 9-month-old daughter, Lillian Rose, lay dead. At first, no one knew something was wrong, but when Rachel's family couldn't reach her, concern grew. She was always in touch with her parents, and suddenly she had gone silent. That's when the investigation began. Rachel's mother, Priscilla Matarazzo, had a gut feeling something was wrong. She had been trying to reach Rachel, but all her calls went unanswered. At first, she thought Rachel was simply busy with the baby, but when an entire day passed with no response, she called one of Rachel's friends and asked if they had heard from her. They hadn't. Growing more anxious, Priscilla and other family members drove to the Entwistle home. Until January 21st, 2006. When they arrived, they found something strange. The house was completely locked. No one answered the door. There was no noise, no lights, and no sign of life inside. Worried but unsure what to do, Rachel's mother contacted the Hopkinton Police Department and requested a welfare check. Officers were sent to investigate. When police officers arrived at the Entwistle home, they found the front door locked. They knocked several times but got no response. They tried contacting Neil but received no answer. At this point, the officers didn't suspect anything sinister. They assumed the family might have gone on an unannounced trip. However, because of Rachel's mother's concerns, they decided to enter the house. What they found inside was horrifying. In the key and master bedroom, officers discovered Rachel's lifeless body lying in bed, partially covered by a blanket. Next to her was her 9-month-old daughter, Lillian Rose, also dead. Both had gunshot wounds. Rachel had been shot in the head, and baby Lillian had been shot in the torso. Oddly, there was no sign of forced entry, no struggle, and nothing was stolen. The crime scene was eerily clean and staged, making it look like Rachel and Lillian had simply gone to sleep and never woken up. However, something was off. If this were a murder-suicide, where was the gun? As officers processed the crime scene, they noticed something strange. His car was gone, his phone was off, and no one had seen or heard from him. This immediately raised suspicion. If Neil had discovered his wife and daughter dead, why hadn't he called the police? Why hadn't he alerted anyone? And why had he vanished without a trace? Investigators began a massive search for Neil Entwistle. Using egg flight records, police quickly discovered that Neil had boarded a plane to England on January 21st, the same day the bodies were found. This discovery shifted the entire case. If Neil had nothing to hide, why would he leave the country just hours after his wife and child were murdered? While searching the crime scene, detectives discovered that the murder weapon was missing. This was critical, because if Rachel had killed herself, the weapon would still be there. Police suspected the gun had been removed from the scene, possibly by Neil. After conducting interviews, detectives learned that Neil had recently visited his father-in-law's home. Before the murders, this led investigators to Priscilla and Joseph Matarazzo, Rachel's parents. When police harassed them about any firearms in the house, Joseph Matarazzo immediately mentioned he had a .22 caliber revolver. When officers asked to check it, the gun was missing. Joseph was shocked. He had never reported the gun stolen and had no idea it was missing. This was a major break in the case. Detectives now had a theory. Neil had taken his father-in-law's gun, killed Rachel and Lillian, and then returned the gun before fleeing to England. To confirm this, they conducted forensic tests on the murder victims. Ballistics analysis revealed that Rachel and Lillian had been shot with a .22 caliber firearm, the same type as Joseph Matarazzo's missing revolver. Additionally, gunshot residue was found on Neil's clothing, linking him to the crime. The case against Neil was building rapidly. Now convinced that Neil was responsible for the murders, police needed to bring him back to the US to face justice. Detectives worked with British authorities to locate Neil. They found him hiding at his parents' house in Worksop, England. Neil acted shocked when police showed up at his parents' door. He claimed he had nothing to do with the murders and that he had left for England to escape the horror of finding his wife and daughter dead. However, when British authorities informed him of the evidence against him, he quickly stopped answering questions. On the February 9th, 2006, Neil Entwistle was officially arrested in England. U.S. authorities requested his extradition, and after a brief legal battle, he was flown back to Massachusetts to face murder charges. By the time Neil was back in the U.S., investigators had gathered overwhelming evidence against him. Gunshot residue on his clothing. The missing .22 caliber revolver linked to the murder. His sudden flight to England hours after the crime. His lack of concern or attempt to contact police. Neil's trial would now determine his fate, but one question remained. Why did he do it? Was it a financial stress? A failed marriage? Or was he simply a man willing to kill to protect his lies? The answers would come in court, and justice was about to be served. After months of investigation and legal battles, Neil Entwistle's trial finally began on June 2nd, 2008. At the Middlesex Superior Court in Massachusetts, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, legal experts, and ordinary people were all eager to see justice unfold in one of the most shocking cases in recent history. Neil, dressed in a dark suit, sat emotionless as the prosecution laid out their case. Would the jury see through his lies, or would he manage to convince them of his innocence? Prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Michael Fabry, painted a grim picture of Neil Entwistle, a husband who couldn't provide, desperate to maintain the illusion of success, and a father who saw murder as his way out, rather than facing his financial ruin. Fabry argued that Neil carefully planned the murders, knowing Rachel was deeply devoted to her family and relied on him. But instead of protecting them, he betrayed them in the worst possible way. The prosecution presented damning forensic evidence. 1. The murder weapon, stolen from Rachel's father, which ballistics confirmed as the gun that killed Rachel and baby Lillian. 2. Gunshot residue. Traces were found on Neil's clothing, proving he had fired a gun. 3. DNA evidence. Rachel's blood was found on Neil's bathrobe, contradicting his claims of not being present during the murders. 4. His suspicious behavior. Neil had immediately fled to England after the killings instead of calling the police. But one of the most chilling pieces of evidence was Neil's internet searches before the crime. Investigators found that Neil had searched for how to kill with a gun and quickest ways to die before the murders. He also visited escort websites, suggesting he had already moved on before his family was even dead. The prosecution ended its argument with a powerful statement. Instead of facing his failures, Neil Entwistle eliminated the people who depended on him the most, his own wife and child. He is not a grieving husband. He is a cold-blooded murderer. Neil's cult defense attorneys, Elliot Weinstein and Stephanie Page, argued that he was innocent and had simply panicked after discovering the bodies. They claimed Neil found Rachel and Lillian already dead and, in shock, fled to England. Rachel may have been the one to pull the trigger, killing their daughter before turning the gun on herself. There was no eyewitness placing Neil at the scene during the murders. However, the defense struggled to explain the forensic evidence and Neil's behavior. The biggest problem? The missing gun. If Rachel had killed herself, the weapon would have been found next to her body. But it wasn't. Neil had returned the gun to his father-in-law's home before fleeing. This alone destroyed the defense's theory. After 12 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for only 8 hours. On June 25, 2008, the courtroom was silent as the judge asked the jury for their decision. The 4 persons stood and spoke the words everyone had been waiting for. Guilty. Neil Entwistle was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, illegal possession of a firearm, illegal possession of ammunition. When the verdict was read, Neil showed no emotion. His face remained blank, but behind him, Rachel's family members burst into tears of relief. The judge then delivered the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Neil Entwistle would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Rachel's family finally had justice. But their pain would never fade. Outside the courtroom, Rachel's mother, Priscilla Matarazzo, addressed reporters. This is the justice Rachel and Lillian deserved, but it does not bring them back. We will never forgive Neil for what he did. She spoke of the pain of losing her daughter and granddaughter. 2 lives taken by a man who was supposed to protect them. Despite Neil's conviction, one question still lingers. Did he ever feel remorse for what he did? To this day, Neil has never confessed, never apologized, and never explained why he destroyed the family that once trusted him completely. Meanwhile, Neil was sent to a maximum security prison in Massachusetts, where he remains to this day. With no possibility of parole, Neil will die in prison, alone and far from the life of luxury he once dreamed of. Many still ask why Neil Entwistle committed such a monstrous act. Was it pure selfishness? The fear of being exposed as a failure? Or was he simply a man without empathy? Whatever the reason, one thing is clear. Rachel and Lillian Rose never deserved this fate. Now, it's your turn to share your thoughts. Do you think Neil had planned this murder long before, or was it a desperate act in the moment? What could have been done to prevent this tragedy? Let's discuss in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more shocking true crime stories from around the world. Until next time, stay safe and stay vigilant. This is Crime Tales Across Times, signing off.